Okay, so you're aiming to be a housing policy officer, huh?
Mhm.
Talk about a career where you can really make a difference. We're diving deep into how to totally ace that interview using all the materials you send over the career guide, those interview tips, even some AI insights from RoleCatcher.
It really is a fascinating field,
Yeah.
blending that data analysis with like a really deep understanding of what the community actually needs. It's not just about the numbers, it's about shaping the whole environment so people can actually thrive.
Exactly. And speaking of numbers, your career guide mentions a 5% growth rate for housing policy officer jobs over the next decade. So that's a good sign for anyone thinking about this path. But before we get into all that long-term stuff, let's nail that interview ride. One question they always seem to ask is, what do you know about the current housing policy landscape? Sounds simple enough, but what are they really getting at?
Oh, you're right. It's totally a trap. They don't want some textbook definition. They want to see your passion, how aware you are of the challenges, if you're staying updated. Like, instead of just saying affordable housing is important, maybe you could mention, oh, I don't know, like the growing gap between how much renters are making and how much housing actually costs, that stat that was highlighted in that research paper you shared.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, that shows you've done your homework, right?
Yeah,
Not just on the job description, but on what's actually going on.
totally. It's like you're showing them you get it,
Mhm.
that you're not just repeating buzzwords, but actually connecting the dots with real data.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to show a little personality in there, too. Were there any housing policy news stories you saw recently that really stuck with you, sharing that can show them, hey, you're genuinely interested in this stuff, even beyond just trying to get the job?
It's about going from I read about this to I actually think about this. That makes a lot of sense. Now, another question they often throw in is, how have you contributed to the development of housing policies in your previous role? But what if you're fresh out of grad school, like you mentioned in your notes?
That's where those transferable skills come in. Even if you haven't had that specific job title, you've got tons to offer. Did you volunteer for any housing rights organizations? Analyze data for a research project? What about that paper you wrote on housing affordability?
Yeah.
All gold mines, right?
So it's about connecting the dots for them.
Yeah,
They might not look at organized community meetings and immediately think housing policy, but you can totally highlight how those experiences actually honed those stakeholder engagement skills, which, let's be real, are super important in this field.
100%. And this is where RoleCatcher's AI can be a game changer. You
Mhm.
mentioned you were curious about it. Imagine a tool that scans all those job descriptions and picks out those keywords, those skills they're really looking for. And then it goes and analyzes your experience, right? Suggest how to frame your answers to directly hit those needs.
Okay, that's actually super cool, like having a personal branding expert in your
Yeah.
pocket. But even with the AI assist, you still need that raw
Oh,
material,
for sure.
those experiences to draw from. And that brings us to another big one. How do you balance the needs of different stakeholders in housing policy development? It just sounds tricky.
It can be. It can be. Think about it. You're dealing with government agencies, community members, developers. Everyone's got their own agenda. So think back to times when you had to navigate different opinions. Remember that group project in grad school where you had to like wrangle everyone to a consensus?
Oh, yeah.
Or even just mediating an argument between your friends. Those are all valuable experiences you can bring up.
So instead of just saying, I'm a good listener, you're saying, remember that time I negotiated a peace treaty between my roommates over whose turn it was to do the dishes?
Exactly.
Yeah, same skills,
Yeah.
just applied to getting developers and community groups on the same page about affordable housing.
You got it. And to really hit it home, sprinkle in examples from your research. The career guide mentioned a case study, I think, about conflicting views on new construction versus historic preservation. Weaving that in shows them you understand the real world stuff they're facing.
Okay, so we're showcasing our experience, we're connecting it to real policy issues, and we're showing them we can handle the people side of things.
Got it. Now let's talk about data. Because it's not just about, being good with people, it's about coming up with solutions that actually make sense. And that brings us to that question. How do you approach analyzing data to inform housing policy decisions? It's like being a detective, kind of like we were talking about before. Remember that picture of those rundown buildings in the career guide? That's not just a picture, it's like a cry for help, right?
Hmm.
So a housing policy officer might use data like vacancy rates or code violations, even the neighborhood demographics, to really paint a picture of what's going on or why.
So you're not just looking at a spreadsheet, you're seeing the story behind the numbers.
Exactly. And then you take that story and you use it to make those policy decisions.
I like it.
And don't be afraid to get into the weeds a little during your interview, you know? Did you work on a data analysis project that really stands out in your mind? Maybe you found something that nobody else noticed. Sharing those moments shows them that data doesn't scare you, it excites you.
Yeah, it's about showing them you can cut through all the noise and find the important stuff, which, let's be real, is super important in a field with this much info coming at you. Now, speaking of information overload, how do you even keep up with all the latest developments in housing policy? It seems like a lot.
Oh, tell me about it. Things are changing constantly. But that's also what makes it so interesting, you know? When they ask, how do you stay up to date with all the latest housing policy developments and trends, they don't want you to, like, list every single article you read. They want to see that you're plugged into the conversation, that you're really engaged.
So how do you actually show them that?
Yeah.
Besides, reading absolutely everything.
Think about it. What journals do you follow? You mentioned housing policy debate in your notes. If you can talk about a recent article that you really connected with, something that sparked your thinking, that shows them you're not just passively absorbing stuff, you're actually thinking critically about it.
Yeah, it's like the difference between watching the news and actually having an opinion. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. One thing you mentioned in your notes was this concern about potentially working with stakeholders who have totally different viewpoints, like even viewpoints that might seem like they're working against equitable housing. So how do you even approach that? And more importantly, how do you address that in an interview?
That's a really important question, and it's something every housing policy officer has to deal with at some point. When they ask, how do you ensure that housing policies are equitable and inclusive, they're looking for a deep understanding of the challenges, right? Not just a simple answer like, everyone deserves a home.
So you have to show them you get the bigger picture.
Yeah, like all those historical and systemic factors that cause these inequalities in the first place.
Right, and how do you bring that up in an interview without giving them a whole history lesson?
Connect the dots. You could say something like, I'm really interested in how historical practices like redlining still affect access to affordable housing today. And in my work on Mention a Project, iHome, and then you share a specific example that shows how you're tackling those issues.
Okay, so you're showing that you're not just talking about it, you're actually doing something about it. That's awesome. Now, on a more practical level, how do you actually engage with community members and other stakeholders when you're coming up with these policies? I mean, it's one thing to have good intentions, but how do you make sure those good intentions turn into tangible actions that really benefit the community?
That's where those people skills we talked about come back in. When they ask, how do you engage with community members and stakeholders in housing policy development? What they really want to see is that you get it. You understand that policies are for people, not the other way around.
So it's about being a bridge between the policymakers and the communities they're serving. How do you make sure everyone has a voice at the table?
Oh, there are tons of ways. Community meetings, surveys. You can even create online platforms for feedback. The important thing is that you create multiple ways for people to participate and make sure those are accessible to everyone.
So it's not just about having a comment period. It's about actively looking for input.
Yeah, especially from communities that are often ignored.
That's huge.
Remember that community outreach project you worked on. That's perfect.
Oh, wow.
Talk about how you got different demographics involved, the challenges you ran into, what you learned from that whole experience.
It's all about showcasing those real-world skills. You're not just talking the talk. You've actually been in the trenches.
Exactly. And while you're thinking back on those projects, don't forget about RoleCatcher. Remember how its AI analyzes job descriptions? It can also help you remember those relevant experiences you might have forgotten about, those hidden gems that show off the exact skills they're looking for.
It's like having a little AI assistant to make sure you're putting your best foot forward.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of putting your best foot forward.
Let's talk about impact. It's one thing to, design policies and all that, but
Yeah.
how do you know they're actually working in the real world?
Right, because good intentions only get you so far.
Exactly. That's where that question, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of housing policies,
Yeah.
comes in. They want to see that you're thinking about results, about how to actually measure if those policies are making a difference.
Show them the receipts.
Yes, and they'll want to see that you get data-driven approaches. Are you looking at those affordability rates? What about homelessness statistics? Are those numbers moving in the right direction?
So it's like, you're the detective again, but this time you're checking the results of the investigation, right?
I like that. And just like a good detective, you need the right tools. Think about your past roles. Did you analyze any specific housing indicators? Were you involved in any surveys or focus groups to see how a policy was landing with people?
Because it always comes back to people, right?
Always.
Are their lives actually better because of this policy?
That's what it's all about. And don't be afraid to talk about the tough stuff, too. Did a policy you worked on fall flat?
Yeah.
Talking about what you learned from that, how you'd approach it differently next time, that shows you're willing to learn and grow, which is so important in this field.
It's about being honest, being able to analyze what went wrong, and always trying to do better. Now, one question I always find fascinating is how housing policy fits into like the bigger picture of social and economic goals. It's not in a vacuum, right?
You're so right. When they ask, how do you work to ensure that housing policies are aligned with broader social and economic goals? They want to see that you're thinking holistically.
Because having a safe, affordable place to live, it impacts every other part of your life,
100%.
Education, job opportunities, even your health.
Exactly. So think about how your work has connected to those bigger goals. Maybe you helped develop a policy that encouraged building affordable housing near public transit.
Yeah.
That makes it easier for people to get to work, to access opportunities. Or maybe you advocated for those mixed-income housing developments that help build stronger communities.
It's about seeing all those connections.
Yes.
And then using those connections to make communities better for everyone.
Exactly. And this is another area where RoleCatcher can really help you shine. Remember how we talked about it, analyzing those job descriptions? It can actually pick out those broader social and economic goals that a specific employer is passionate about, so you can tailor your answers to really show them you're on the same page.
It's like having a secret weapon. Okay, love it.
Right. It's about using every tool you've got to really put your best foot forward. And remember, the interview is just one step. Your career guide lays out a whole path for growth, from entry level all the way to leadership roles. Don't be afraid to talk about your ambitions.
Yeah, let them know you're in it for the long haul. That this isn't just a job, it's a whole career where you can really make a difference.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, this work isn't about policies and spreadsheets and data. It's about people. It's about making sure that everyone has a safe and affordable place to call home. And that's something worth fighting for.
And I said it better myself. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into becoming a housing policy officer. We covered a ton, from understanding what the role actually involves, to nailing those interview questions, and even how RoleCatcher can give you that extra edge. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the things that matter to you.